Hey everyone, ready to dive deep. Today, it's all about psychosemantics.
Ooh, yeah. That's how we create our own realities, right?
You got it. And we're using a fascinating lecture by Viktor Petrenko as our guide. He was a Russian psychologist, really shook things up.
I've heard of him, yeah.
Well, in this lecture, he makes all these connections between psychology and culture, even throws in altered states of consciousness, a bit of physics. Wild.
I'm intrigued already.
So, to kick things off, what exactly did Petrenko find out about how art and culture shape our worldviews? I mean, it's easy to say art reflects culture, but did his research go deeper?
Absolutely. Petrenko found that some types of art, especially abstract art, could actually change how people see themselves and the world around them.
Interesting. Can you give me an example?
Sure, he found that people who were exposed to abstract art, they actually scored higher on those tests that measure cognitive complexity and open-mindedness.
So they became more open to new ideas and ways of thinking.
Exactly. Petrenko argued that's because abstract art forces us to deal with ambiguity. We have to construct our own meaning instead of passively accepting prepackaged ideas.
So it's not just that different cultures see art differently, but that art itself can actually change how we think, almost like a mental workout.
That's a great way to put it.
That's amazing. And he didn't stop there, did he?
Nope, not at all. He took these ideas and applied them to politics, showing how political ideologies are like filters that shape how we see events, even influence our memories.
Wait a minute, you're saying my political beliefs can actually change what I remember about something that happened? Really?
It might sound crazy, but his research actually suggests that's true. He found that people, well, they tend to remember things in a way that lines up with their political views, even if those memories are, well, objectively wrong.
Whoa, okay. So our mental maps aren't just about our personal experiences. They're also shaped by the groups we belong to, the beliefs we hold.
Right, exactly. And these maps, they're not set in stone either. They're constantly being updated and reshaped by new experiences and information.
Which brings us to Petrenko's work with altered states of consciousness. He had that pretty intense experience with the Amanita muscaria mushrooms, right?
Yeah, during his time in Chukotka, he was studying indigenous Siberian culture there.
Right. He wanted to understand how they used Amanita muscaria in their shamanistic practices.
Exactly. But he didn't just observe, he actually participated. He wanted to experience those altered states for himself.
Wow, that's dedication to research. But how does one uh, mushroom trip in Siberia, of all places, connect to the bigger picture of psychosemantics?
Well, Petrenko believed that experience showed how incredibly valuable our perception is. He argued that if something as fundamental as our sense of self and reality can be so drastically altered, then our everyday perceptions are probably much less stable and objective than we think.
Okay, so the mushrooms were, let's say, a dramatic example of how much our reality can shift. But how does this apply to, everyday life? Did he find ways to track those smaller, more subtle shifts in perception we all experience all the time?
That's where his work with multidimensional semantic spaces comes in.
Multi what now?
It sounds complicated, but just imagine a 3D map. But instead of places, it's words. Like one axis might be good, bad, another powerful, weak, and so on.
I'm kind of getting it.
But Trunko used this to demonstrate how our view of a word, say freedom, changes depending on our culture, our experiences, even our mood at that moment.
So it's not just knowing the dictionary definition of a word, but understanding the whole web of personal and cultural associations we have with it.
Precisely. And that helps explain why communication can be so tricky. We often use the same words, but we're actually operating within completely different semantic spaces. What I see as powerful, you might see as threatening. And that all comes down to our individual mental maps.
So how do we find common ground if our realities are so subjective? Is it even possible?
Now that's where it gets really interesting. Petrenko was very critical of traditional psychology's focus on the individual.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, he argued that by neglecting the social and cultural context, we miss a crucial piece of the puzzle. Our sense of self, our values, even our perceptions are formed by the communities we're part of and the stories we share.
But isn't focusing on the individual sometimes necessary? Like in therapy, if someone is struggling with anxiety, wouldn't we need to understand their unique experiences and thought patterns?
Of course, individual therapy is absolutely crucial. But Petrenko believed that ignoring the social dimension can limit our understanding and ultimately the effectiveness of therapy.
Okay, I see.
He pointed out that a lot of psychological problems come not just from individual factors, but from difficult relationships, cultural pressures, or even societal inequalities.
Okay, so if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, our mental maps are shaped not just by our own experiences, but by the shared realities of our cultures and communities as well.
Exactly. And that means we have to pay attention to those collective representations, the shared beliefs, myths, and narratives that shape how a society sees the world.
But how do we separate what's uniquely personal from what's culturally influenced? Those things seem so intertwined all the time.
Absolutely they are. And that's one of the challenges of psychosemantics. It's not about drawing hard lines, but recognizing the interplay between individual and collective influences.
All right, I think I'm starting to get how this all connects. So Petrenko's saying we don't just passively observe reality, we actively construct it through our experiences, our culture, even our beliefs. But this whole idea of a constructed reality has a huge implication, right? It changes how effective therapy can be.
You got it. And that's where Petrenko's work gets really exciting. He believed that by understanding how people construct their own realities, we can come up with more effective therapies.
So instead of just trying to change someone's thoughts or behaviors, we have to understand the mental maps that are creating those thoughts and behaviors.
Precisely. It's like, imagine a doctor treating a symptom without understanding the actual disease. You might get temporary relief, but the problem's going to come back.
That makes a lot of sense. So how did Petrenko actually apply these ideas in a therapeutic setting? Did he develop any specific techniques?
He did. One of his key contributions was using psychosemantic methods, like remember the semantic differential we talked about,
Right.
to actually map and understand a patient's mental world.
So instead of just listening to a patient describe their problems, therapists could use these tools to actually visualize the patient's subjective reality, kind of see the world through their eyes.
Exactly. And that could lead to more personalized, more effective therapies.
Okay, so now I'm really curious. What did he discover about the mental maps of alcoholics when he used these methods? Was there a common thread?
Well, one of the key things he found was that alcoholics, they often had a very rigid and negative self-image.
Oh, like they saw themselves in a bad light.
Yeah, they saw themselves as powerless, trapped by their addiction.
So their mental map of self, it was distorted, which led to those feelings of hopelessness.
Exactly. And this negative self-image, it reinforced their drinking.
They felt like they couldn't change, so why even bother trying?
Yeah, exactly. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe you're powerless, then you're less likely to take steps to change.
That makes a lot of sense, but how did Petrenko actually use this insight to help them? Did he try to, directly challenge those negative beliefs?
He did, but not just through regular talk therapy.
Oh, okay, so something more.
Yeah, he used a combination of techniques including hypnosis and guided imagery.
Really? To help alcoholics?
Yeah, to help them reshape their mental maps.
So he was, rewiring their brains.
You could say that he believed that talk therapy is valuable, but it's often not enough to overcome those really deep-seated patterns.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Think of it this way. Talk therapy can help you understand the map, but sometimes you need more powerful tools to actually redraw the map itself.
Okay, so hypnosis and guided imagery, those were like his cartography tools for the mind.
That's a great analogy. He used these techniques to help patients create new, more positive associations with themselves and their ability to change.
Can you give us an example of how that might look in practice? Like what kind of imagery did he use?
Sure. So in one case, he worked with this patient who's been struggling with alcoholism for years. And through guided imagery, he helped this patient visualize himself as a strong, capable individual, climbing a mountain, overcoming obstacles.
So like each step forward represented progress.
Yeah, each step up the mountain represented a step towards sobriety.
So he was basically helping the patient create a whole new story about himself and his relationship with alcohol.
Exactly. And by repeatedly experiencing this new story through the guided imagery, the patient started to internalize it. His mental map of self, it began to shift, and his behaviors started to change too.
Wow, that's powerful. It really shows how flexible the brain is, our capacity to change, even when we're dealing with those ingrained patterns.
Precisely. And that's where Petrenko's work goes beyond just individual therapy. He believed that if we can change individual mental maps, then we can also change collective ones.
Whoa, hold on. Are you saying that if enough people change their own mental maps, it can actually shift the whole cultural landscape? Like, how is that even possible?
Well, think about how social movements happen. They start with individuals who start questioning the dominant narrative, right? Challenging the status quo.
Okay, and then more people join in.
Right. And as more people join the movement, their shared beliefs and values start to influence others, and that fuels a ripple effect.
So it's like a snowball effect. Individual change builds momentum and eventually leads to bigger societal shifts.
Exactly. And Petrenko believed that psychosemantics could play a key role in this process by giving us the tools to understand and reshape those collective stories.
Okay, I'm starting to see how it all connects. So we start by acknowledging that reality, it's subjective, it's constructed through our individual and cultural lenses. And then we can use these tools from psychosemantics to map those subjective realities.
Yeah.
To understand those mental models that are shaping our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors.
Right.
And then we can use this understanding for personal growth, for therapy, and even for societal change, that's a pretty ambitious framework.
It is, but Petrenko, he was a visionary. He really believed that by understanding how we create our own realities, we could unlock human potential like never before.
That's inspiring, but it also feels a little daunting. If our realities are so easily influenced, so shaped by all these invisible forces, how can we be sure we're not being manipulated? How do we even know what's real anymore?
That's a really valid concern, and it's one that Petrenko acknowledged, too. He really emphasized the importance of critical thinking, of questioning our assumptions, and of being aware of all the ways our perceptions can be influenced.
So it's not about becoming immune to all these influences.
Right.
It's about becoming more aware of them.
Exactly. It's about developing what he called semantic vigilance, the ability to really evaluate the messages we're getting and to decide which ones we let in.
So it's like building a filter for our minds, separating the real from the fake.
Yeah, precisely. And this is something we can all develop through things like mindfulness, self-reflection, and talking to people who have different viewpoints.
Okay, so we've covered how our mental maps are shaped by culture and personal experiences, but Petrenko also took inspiration from a pretty surprising source, Einstein's theory of relativity. So how did he connect physics with psychology?
Well, he argued that just like measurements and observations in physics are relative to the observer's frame of reference, our perceptions of reality in psychology are also relative.
Okay, we definitely need an analogy here to help us understand this. So in Einstein's theory, time and space, they warp near the speed of light.
Right?
And similarly, our perception of reality can totally shift under extreme psychological conditions, like during an intense emotional experience or under hypnosis, or even after taking psychoactive substances like those mushrooms he took.
Exactly. And this warping, it's not random. Our emotional states, our motivations, our cultural background, all of that acts like features shaping how we interpret the world. And Petrenko believed that understanding these frames of reference, that's the key to understanding human behavior.
So if our mental maps are like those warped space-time diagrams, how do we even find common ground? Are we all just destined to live in our own separate realities?
Well, that's where Petrenko's emphasis on dialogue and shared meaning comes in. He believed that even though our perceptions might be different, we can still find common ground through communication, through empathy, and through a willingness to understand each other's points of view.
So it's not about erasing those differences, but finding ways to connect across them.
Exactly. And that's what makes his work so hopeful. He believed that by understanding how subjective reality is, we can become more tolerant, more compassionate, and more effective at resolving conflicts.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot here, from how reality is constructed to how changeable perception is. And we even touched on the role of culture, society, and even physics in shaping our mental maps. But I'm curious about how Vitrenko's work was received. Was it immediately embraced by the psychology community?
Well, his ideas, they're pretty radical, especially during his time in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I can imagine those ideas about the subjective nature of reality probably didn't go over so well with the authorities back then.
Exactly. His work really challenged the dominant materialistic and behaviorist views that were popular in Soviet psychology at the time. And even in the West, his work wasn't always fully understood or appreciated.
So he was kind of a rebel in the field of psychology.
You could say that. But even though he faced challenges, his work has had a lasting impact. It's inspired so many researchers to explore human perception and to develop new ways of understanding consciousness.
And what about his legacy today? Are his ideas still relevant in modern psychology?
Absolutely. In fact, a lot of his ideas are now being explored through neuroscience. Researchers are using brain imaging to map how perception works in the brain and to study how our brains construct our experience of reality.
So his work was almost like a precursor to neuropsychosemantics.
You could say that. It's really exciting to see how his work continues to inspire new discoveries and push the boundaries of what we know.
That's incredible. So even though he faced resistance, his ideas have really stood the test of time, and they're still shaping how we think about the mind and its relationship to the world.
Exactly. And that's a testament to the power of his ideas and his commitment to exploring the mysteries of human consciousness.
Okay, so we've explored some really profound implications of Petrenko's work. But before we finish up, I want to circle back to his research methods. We've talked about the semantic differential, but did he use any other techniques to study how people construct their realities?
He did. He developed this fascinating technique called guided semantic fantasies.
Okay, guided semantic fantasies. That sounds intriguing. What are those?
It's basically a guided imagery technique where people are asked to imagine themselves in different situations and then describe their thoughts, feelings, and perceptions.
So it's like a structured daydream. But what was the point of guiding these fantasies? What kind of information was he hoping to get?
He was interested in understanding how people's values, beliefs, and expectations All of that shaped how they interpreted events. So he would give people these ambiguous scenarios and then analyze their responses to see how they created meaning.
Can you give me an example? What kind of scenarios did he use?
Well, in one study, he asked people to imagine themselves walking through a forest and running into a stranger. And he wanted to see how their perceptions of this stranger would be influenced by their own anxieties and cultural biases.
So by looking at how they reacted to this imaginary encounter, he could learn about their underlying mental max.
Exactly. He found that people's responses often revealed a lot about their fears, their prejudices, and their assumptions about the world.
That's so interesting. So even in our imaginations, our personal realities come through.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this technique so powerful. It lets researchers tap into those deeper levels of meaning-making that are often happening below conscious awareness.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What did he learn about how people perceive strangers? Was there any common thread?
Well, one of the most interesting findings, was that people's perceptions of the stranger were really influenced by their own anxieties.
Oh, so like if someone was generally more anxious, they saw the stranger as more of a threat.
Yeah, exactly. Even though the scenario itself was totally ambiguous.
So our fears and insecurities, they can actually change how we see other people. Like we're projecting our own inner world onto the world around us.
Precisely. And that has huge implications for how we interact with others, especially people who are different from us.
Yeah, our biases and assumptions, they can really create walls between us.
Exactly. They prevent real communication and understanding.
It's like we're all walking around with these invisible shields trying to protect ourselves from threats that might not even be real. And those shields, they also stop us from really connecting with each other.
That's a great way to put it. And that's where Petrenko's work is so powerful. By becoming aware of those biases, those mental filters, we can start to break down those barriers and create more genuine connections.
So self-awareness is crucial. It's not about pretending we don't have biases, but recognizing them and then deciding how we want to respond to them.
Exactly. It's about developing what he called semantic flexibility. The ability to shift our perspective to see things from different angles.
Like becoming more adaptable in our thinking.
Yeah, and that helps us be more open-minded, more empathetic, and better communicators.
Okay, so we've talked about the individual and collective things that shape our mental maps, but what about the practical applications of all this? How can we actually use these insights to improve our lives, our relationships, and even society as a whole?
Well, on a personal level, understanding psychosemantics can help us become more aware of our own biases.
Right.
It can help us challenge those limiting beliefs and create more empowering stories for ourselves.
And it can help us communicate better.
Absolutely. It can help us build stronger relationships and handle conflicts in a more constructive way.
And what about on a societal level? How can this work help us build a more just and fairer world?
Petrenko believed that if we understand how these collective narratives are formed and how they influence our behavior,
Yeah.
we can come up with strategies to challenge harmful stereotypes, to build understanding between cultures, and to create social movements that are based on shared values and a common vision for the future.
So it's not just about changing individual minds, but changing the whole cultural landscape.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all co-creating this reality, and if we work together, we can shape a world that's more compassionate and more aligned with our best selves.
Wow, that's powerful. It's both inspiring and kind of scary. It suggests that we have way more power than we realize, but also a much bigger responsibility for the world we create.
Absolutely, and that's Viktor Petrenko's legacy. He challenged us to see the world differently, to recognize the power of our own perceptions, and to really grasp the transformative potential of understanding how we construct our realities.
That's a perfect way to wrap things up. So as we finish our deep dive into the world of psychosemantics, I want to leave you with this thought. Your reality, it's not fixed. It's fluid and dynamic and constantly changing, and you have the power to shape it.
Yeah, embrace that power.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into psychosemantics. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep expanding your understanding of this incredible world we call reality.